Hey guys, in this video we'll take a look at how backpropagation moves backwards through the network to update our learnable parameters. In our previous video we saw how backpropagation uses the chain rule to calculate the derivative of our network's loss with respect to a weight in the output layer. We'll build on the math we did in that video, so if you haven't seen that video you can find a link to it in the description. Now in our previous video we saw that using the chain rule, the derivative of our loss function with respect to our weight will be computed as a product of these three derivatives. We looked at how each of these terms is calculated and we got this result. After computing the derivatives of the loss with respect to our output layer connections, backpropagation moves backwards through the network to compute the derivatives of the loss with respect to the connections that go into layer L-1. We'll take the weight between node 0 in layer 2 and node 2 in layer L-1 to demonstrate how this is calculated. Using the chain rule to find the derivative of the loss function with respect to this weight, we get the derivative of the loss function with respect to the activation output of node 2 in layer L-1 multiplied by the derivative of the activation output with respect to the input that goes into node 2 multiplied by the derivative of the input with respect to our weight. This equation looks similar to the one we saw in the last video, and the second and last terms are calculated the same way as the ones in the previous video. Again, you can find the video in the description to see how these terms are calculated. The first term will be calculated differently for non-output layer connections, and that's where the focus of this video will be. In the previous video we saw that the loss function at one node in the output layer delta sub j can be computed as the activation output on node j minus the expected value of that node squared, and we said this allows us to view the loss as a function of the activation output on that node. The reason we say this is because the activation output of that node in layer L has a direct influence on our loss. In this example, however, for the first term in our computation, we are taking the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation output of a node in layer L-1. This node does not directly influence our loss, and we won't find A sub j in layer L-1 in the equation for our loss function. So we cannot say the loss function is a function of this activation output because this output does not directly influence the loss function. However, we know that the activation function output of the node in L-1 has influence on the input for all the nodes in the output layer. This is because the input on node J in layer L can be computed as the summation of the product of the activation outputs of all the nodes in layer L-1 and the weights that connect them to node J. Because in the equation describing the input to nodes in layer L, we have the activation function outputs of nodes in layer L-1. We can think of these inputs as functions of these activation outputs. Bringing our focus back to the term we're trying to solve, applying the chain rule to the derivative of our loss with respect to our activation output will give us the summation of j from 0 to n-1, with n being the number of nodes in layer L, of the derivative of our loss with respect to the activation output of node j in layer L, multiplied by the derivative of this activation output with respect to the input of that node, multiplied by the derivative of the input with respect to the activation output of node 2 in layer L-1. For the first term in this summation, we use the activation output of the nodes in the output layer because they directly influence our loss. The second term is the derivative of this activation output with respect to the input that goes into our node in layer L. And the third term is the derivative of this input with respect to the activation output of node 2 in layer L-1. We can take this derivative because we have seen that this activation function output directly influences the value of the input to the nodes in layer L. In our previous video, we saw that the derivative of the loss function with respect to the weights between node J in layer L and node K in layer L-1 will give us the product of three derivatives. If we look at the first two terms of this product, they look exactly like the first two terms within our summation. Since we saw how these terms are calculated in the last video, we won't be looking through them in this one. Instead, we'll focus on the last term within our summation, which is the derivative of the input to node J in layer L with respect to the activation function output of node 2 in layer L minus 1. Recall that the input to node J can be expressed as the summation of the product between the activation outputs of the nodes in the previous layer and the weights in the connections between them and node J. When we expand our summation, we get this summation, and applying the sum rule, we get the sum of the derivatives of all the terms in our summation. Again, if we visually inspect these derivatives, we will notice that only one of them has a sub 2 in it, and this gives us w with the superscript L and the subscripts j and 2, while the rest of these terms go to 0. Now we can bring back this result into our summation, and putting it together with the results from the other two terms, we get this summation as the derivative of the loss function with respect to the activation function of node 2 in layer L minus 1. Remember that what we're trying to solve in this video is the derivative of the loss with respect to the weight that connects node 2 in layer L minus 1 to node 0 in the previous layer. And the derivative of our loss with respect to the activation function output is one of the three terms that needed to be solved. The other two terms are computed the same way they were in the previous video. So putting these three terms together will give us this result. So we've seen that to solve the derivative of the loss with respect to a weight of a connection going into the output layer, backpropagation computes the derivative of the loss with respect to the activation output and input of our node in layer L. It then moves backwards through the network to compute the derivative of the loss with respect to the weights going into layer L minus 1. And to do this, backpropagation has to compute the derivative of our loss with respect to the activation output of a node in layer L minus 1. Solving this derivative involves computing the derivative of our loss with respect to the activation outputs and inputs of all the nodes in layer L. Since backpropagation has already computed these derivatives, it leverages all the computation it has already done and uses the results to solve the derivative of the loss with respect to the weights going into L minus 1. So backpropagation propagates the loss backwards through the network by repeatedly applying the chain rule as it moves backwards through the network's layers. That will be all for this video, and I hope it has given you a better idea of how backpropagation computes the derivative of the loss with respect to the learnable parameters of our network. In the next video, we'll build and train a simple neural network using TensorFlow. So if you're looking forward to that video, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.